Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the school board. My name is Katie Mayotte, and my discussion today is going to be examining close reading in the classroom, specifically at Miller Middle School, which is where I teach. I know Marshalltown really focuses on reading within the classroom, specifically at Miller due to reading instruction support as well as literature and writing being split. So the focus within my classroom is to examine the close read. First, we must examine what does it mean for text complicity or complexity. We must look at the qualitative and quantitative resources. Quantitative is actually the easier one to understand because it covers the facts and figures of reading. It covers items like lexile order as well as word count and length, whereas qualitative seems to be more the teacher focus. We want to examine the relationship between the text and the student. Specifically, how does the student relate to that text? Do they have the background knowledge they need? Are they able to read the text comfortably? Is it too difficult? Is it too easy? Do they have the vocabulary and structural knowledge available to them in order to read, which I think is important in Marshalltown mostly because of the English language learner population. We really need to examine, does a text allow them to learn both the language and the content in a way that they can use and apply it further in their learning. So understanding the qualitative aspects of a text is very important. We can look up the quantitative aspects, but they may not always be reliable, so understanding that relationship between the text and the student is vital in choosing a text to close read. Step 1 is understanding what close reading is, and close reading is basically the close examination of a text. The goal is to increase stamina with students as well as allow them to dig deeper into their understandings of how to read and look at the aspects or components of reading as to how it attributes to the world around them, as well as other media sources. So the goal of close reading is to examine specific parts of a text that are short enough to reread. Step 2, what does a text have to have in order to be considered a close read? First, we need to be able to scaffold activities, which this is actually a part of the district initiative in SIOP. So it's important that teacher activities create an environment so that students can succeed in their close reading, especially if they are not accustomed to doing so. Secondly, this text needs to be short enough to be able to reread. Students need to be able to read it independently as well as in groups, or be able to listen to it repeatedly in order to adequately read the text and close read it. The text, as I stated, does need to be short, but it also needs to be meaningful. Choosing a text that is not meaningful to students, both within their purposes, doesn't make sense. Meaningful texts don't always mean canon texts. Rather, meaningful texts may have relationships with the students, as we discussed, as well as have topics or goals that the teacher can achieve the task they want the students to succeed in. Next, it needs to inspire peer interactions. Students need to be able to collaborate with one another in order to discuss and deepen their understanding of the text. Lastly, the questions that need to be asked from the teacher need to be text dependent, meaning the student needs to be able to search within the text in order to find the answers. Skimming or scanning the text or finding the answers on Sparks Notes are not close read text-dependent questions, so the teacher needs to make sure that the student is engaging in the text at a level that allows them to look closely at the text itself. Step 3 is engagement, and for this I wrote the 3 I's. In other words, in order for me to remember that a close read is engaging, it needs to have interaction with the text. Students need to be able to write and read and scribble on their text to help create understanding. They also need to be able to evaluate the confusing moments of the text, either through writing or speaking or discussing with their peers. The second I is independent. They need to be independent thinkers and be able to read independently within the text. So, creating that independent thought or that independent reader is our ultimate goal. Lastly, it needs to be in-depth. Again, it is not enough to just simply scan or evaluate a text. Rather, the thinking needs to be a higher order DOK or level of thinking, level of knowledge, depth of knowledge thinking, and it allows the student to become in-depth and use the higher functions of their brain. For my example in my classroom, I used the poem Somewhere in America by Rhiannon McCavan, Melissa Esposito, and Zainara Allen. And this is actually the video of them performing their slam poem on Queen Latifah's show. For time purposes, I won't show it to you, but you have access to the PowerPoint to watch it if you so choose. For my first day as a teacher, now obviously these lesson plans are flexible. It really depends on how discussion goes, but generally speaking, this lesson plan should take anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. The first day I'm going to focus on similes and metaphors, and I would review what similes and metaphors are with my students so that they can have the common background knowledge they need. Then we would listen to the poem, and each student would be given a copy of the poem to write on as we go along throughout the course of the day. The students would be instructed then to get into groups and underline the similes and metaphors they see within the text itself. So through underlining and interacting with that text, I hit my first I. The goal of this is obviously to maintain familiarity with the text, as well as locating and focusing on pieces of literature, not just being able to summarize what the poem's about. After students are able to look at the text for similes and metaphors, as a group, I would like them to choose one simile or metaphor to turn into a picture. They can either do this digitally or they can do it on by hand, but I want a visual representation of what they think that simile is. And as we share out to the group, it would be able to see how different people interpret different metaphors, and they could expand their understanding that way. This actually meets Iowa Core Standards 3 and 4 for reading literature, so it's a good way to start off the unit. On day 2, we're going to look at rhymes, assonance, and alliterations. Rhymes and assonance and alliterations are all focused on individual words or word groups, and we would obviously review what each of those mean. The student would be able to read the poem this time instead of listen to it, and they would read it in their group. They would mark the different pieces of figurative language, such as rhymes. When does the poem rhyme? When do the assonants or vowel sounds sound the same? And when are their alliterations? My example would be the first line of the poem when the students alliterate state, single, set, standard, and subject. So we as a class would discuss why those words might be important in determining the beginning of the poem, and then why might they stress those when the poem is about school and learning and what is missing in education. Day 2, we would focus on character voice. Most of this day would be independent. They should now read the poem for different voices heard within the poem itself. So in this case, I want them to star or highlight the different character voices they hear and which one they relate to the most. They're going to choose an aspect of the character or a poem and actually go home with homework on this day where they look and they see how does this character's voice compare to that of a TV show or that of a book they're currently reading, and how does that compared to what we hear in the poem. So how does that voice then carry over, and why does the word choice change in a poem when it doesn't in other forms of media? So they would have a guided question and guided homework for this day to help deepen their understanding of character voice. Day 4, we're going to focus on theme, and we're going to look at how all of the pieces, the alliteration, the assonance, the rhyme scheme, the voice, how do they all fit together to create a theme, and how does that theme change throughout the piece? So they're going to be required to support their reasoning with different pieces of the poem to basically build a strong understanding of the goal of that poem as well as how that carries over. So we've introduced several new standards with these past few days, including Reading for Literature 9 and 6, as well as Writing Standard 1 and 4. So for this final assessment, they're going to write and share an analysis paper about the poem, giving both strengths and weaknesses. They should support it with the text itself. So they would use what they've done over the past week to determine whether or not this is a poem that is worth teaching and what makes it strong or weak. And I would encourage the student to look at both strengths and weaknesses to challenge that a poem is not innately good or innately bad, rather it is both. And at the end of that paper, they would be required to recommend who would like that poem or who would benefit from listening to that poem, which forces them to think about a wider audience. For the full lesson plan, you can actually click on this link here, which would take you to the full lesson plan, which describes the day-to-day activities. I really appreciate you listening to my presentation today. If you want more information or want to dig in deeper, I strongly encourage the piece Engaging Adolescent Learners by Nancy Fry and Mr. Fisher. Thanks again, and please let me know if you have any questions.